She was 19 and had just been thrown out. Not eased out, not sent on her way with a blessing, thrown with a slammed door and a shouted word into the dark of a street that no longer had a place for her. And with $10, the last money she had, she bought a boarded-up Mercantile on the dead main street of a bypassed town in the Wyoming territory. A store the town had left to rot when the mines closed. The big front windows were soaked over and cracked. The shelves inside stood empty and leaning. The freight agent in the next town told her the town was finished, the trade was gone, and a girl alone in an empty store on a dead street wouldn't last the winter. But what nobody knew, not the agent, not the town, not the girl herself, was that behind the great flour bin at the back of that old store, sealed away since 1878, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clementine Ashford had grown up behind a counter, and it was the only place in the world she had ever felt she understood. She was born in 1872 in a Wyoming town, the daughter of a storekeeper, and before she could reach the shelves she was learning the trade, the weights and measures, the credit book, the 1,000 small courtesies of a country store, which is not really a place that sells goods, but a place that holds a community together with sugar and thread and patience. Her father taught her that a good storekeeper was the heart of a hard town, that credit extended in a lean season was a kind of faith, and that the ledger where you wrote down what folks owed was also the ledger of who you had chosen to trust. Her mother taught her the other half of it, the listening, the remembering, the way you set a lonely widow's order aside with a kind word, the way a store could be a mercy dressed up as a business. By the time Clementine was 14, she could run the whole store alone, and did, on the days her father's cough kept him abed. The cough took him when she was 17, and here the story of Clementine Ashford turned the way so many of these stories turn, on the arrival of someone who saw a grieving girl and a going concern and did the arithmetic. Her father's store had been prosperous, or as prosperous as a small town store could be, and a widowed man from the county seat named Barnaby Thorne, who had buried 2 wives and their money both, came courting Clementine's mother within the year, and married her and moved into the rooms above the store and set about the patient business of making it all his. He was charming to Clementine's mother and cold to Clementine, and he understood, as men like him always do, that the girl was the danger, the one who knew the trade, knew the books, knew that the store had been her father's and not his. For 2 years he worked to make her small. He hired a clerk and gave the boy Clementine's work. He told her mother the girl was sullen, was ungrateful, was too much underfoot. And when Clementine's mother died suddenly of a winter fever, in the 2nd year, there was nothing left standing between Clementine and the man who now, by marriage, held the deed to everything her father had built. He moved fast, because grief makes people slow, and he counted on it. Within a month of the funeral, he told Clementine that the arrangement could not continue, that a grown girl of 19 had no claim on a stepfather's property, that it was unseemly for her to remain, and that he had generously decided to let her leave with her own clothes and no trouble. When she stood in the store her father had left her and said that the store was hers by right, that she had run it, that everyone in town knew whose it was, Barnaby Thorne threw her out into the street with his own hands and shouted after her, for the neighbors to hear that the poor girl had gone hysterical with grief and had to be removed for her own good. The neighbors watched from their windows. Not one opened a door. That was the part Clementine carried longest, not the throwing out, but the watching, the way a whole town she had weighed sugar for and extended credit to and listened to across the counter for 19 years stood behind its glass and let it happen. She understood later why they had not come out, and the understanding was almost worse than the wound. It was not that they did not know whose store it was. Every soul in that town knew Clementine had run it, knew her father had left it to her, knew Barnaby Thorne for exactly what he was. It was that they owed him now. He held the store, and the store held their credit. And a family that spoke up for the thrown-out girl was a family that might find its own line of credit suddenly closed. So they stood behind their glass and did the arithmetic that fear does, and they chose their own safety over her justice, one darkened window at a time. Clementine did not hate them for it. She had stood behind enough counters to know how fear worked on decent people, how a man like Thorne could turn a whole town's kindness against itself simply by making kindness expensive. But she never forgot it, either, the sight of all those lit windows and all those still doors, and it taught her the thing that would shape the rest of her life. That a store was not just a business, but a power, and that the person who held it could use it to free a town or to make it afraid. And that those were the only two choices there ever really were. She had $10 her father had once sewn into the hem of her good coat against a hard day, and the clothes on her back, and a storekeeper's whole education, and nowhere on earth to go. For a while she worked, clerking where a girl could clerk, which was rarely and briefly and badly paid, and she saved nothing, because there was nothing to save. And she nursed, in the meantime, not a plan for revenge, because revenge was not in her nature, but a single stubborn wish, a counter of her own. A store that no stepfather, no charming widower, no man with a deed could ever throw her out of, because the deed would be hers, and the counter would be hers, and the trade would be hers, the way it had been meant to be. She heard about the Mercantile the way storekeepers hear things, in a freight yard, from a teamster complaining about his routes. There was a dead town off the main line, he said Roselle, in the high country, that had boomed on copper and died when the copper played out, and its Mercantile had stood empty for years, boarded and rotting, the last big store on a street of ghosts. County'd sell it for $10 just to clear the tax rolls. Who'd want it? A store needs customers, and Roselle had maybe 100 souls left, too poor and too stubborn to leave. The teamster laughed. But Clementine Ashford did not laugh, because she had $10, and because a Mercantile, even a dead one, on a dead street, in a dying town, was the one building in all the territory that was shaped exactly like the life that had been stolen from her. She rode a freight wagon up into the high country and walked the last stretch into Roselle, and it was as dead as the teamster had said, a single main street running between two rows of false-fronted buildings, weathered gray. Half of them boarded. The mine works on the hill above, gone to rust. The whole place held in the enormous silence of a country that men had come to and used up and left. But it was not entirely empty. There were the 100 who remained, the ones with nowhere else to go. And Clementine passed them on the dead street, a woman at a pump, an old man on a porch, children who stopped their game to stare, and she saw in their faces the thing she knew better than anything in the world. The particular worn patience of people a store had stopped serving. A town without a store is a town coming apart, each family alone with its own 2 days' haul to the railhead, and Roselle had the look of a place slowly forgetting how to be a town at all. The Mercantile stood at the center of the dead street, the grandest ruin on it, a tall false-fronted building with big display windows soaped gray and cracked, Mercantile still legible in faded gilt across its front, its double doors chained and boarded. Clementine stood in the empty street and looked at it, and where the teamster had seen a rotting store in a dead town. She saw a heart that had stopped, a town's heart stopped, that she knew exactly how to start again. The county's business was done in the live town down the line at a freight and land office run by a brisk man named Emmett Crawl, who could not imagine why the girl wanted the Roselle store. It was worthless, he told her plainly. The town was finished, the copper was gone, and would not come back. The store had been empty 6 years since old Roselle himself, the founder. The man the town was named for had died with no heir, and the place had gone to the county for taxes. There was nothing in it, Krull said, but empty shelves and mouse ruin, and $10 would make it hers, but he'd be doing her a wrong not to say plainly that she was buying a headstone with the town's name on it. Clementine laid $10 on his desk, her father's hard day money, that she had carried through everything and never spent, and signed her name in a fair clear hand, and Emmett Krall gave her the deed and the keys to the chains, and the strong opinion that she'd be back down the line inside a month. She was not back inside a month. By the time she'd broken the chains off the doors of the Roselle Mercantile, the 100 souls of the town had heard. Because in a town of 100 a new face is an event, and a new face buying the dead store is a wonder. They gathered, a few of them, in the street to watch her wrestle the boards off the windows, not hostile, mostly, just amazed. And beneath the amazement something Clementine recognized, and it broke her heart a little. Hope. Held down hard. The way you hold down a thing that has disappointed you too many times to trust. An old woman named Dorcas Webb, who had kept the town's post corner going out of her front room since the store closed, came and stood at Clementine's elbow and asked, almost afraid to, whether the girl truly meant to open the store again. And when Clementine said yes she did, the old woman put a hand to her mouth, because a store meant the town might live, and she had not let herself hope that in 6 years. The doors came open, and Clementine stepped into the wreck of the Mercantile, and where the town saw ruin, she saw the bones of everything she loved. The long counter, oak, dust gray, but sound. The great wall of shelving and cubbies and drawers. The tall windows that would pour light again once the soap was scrubbed away. The pot-bellied stove where the men would gather. And at the back, past the dry goods shelves, the heavy provision fixtures, the coffee bins, the cracker barrels, and the great flour bin. A huge built-in wooden hopper the size of a wardrobe, where a country store kept the flour it sold by the scoop. It was all there, the whole apparatus of the thing she had been born to do, dead and dust-shrouded and waiting. Clementine walked the length of the counter with her hand on the wood, and behind it, for the first time since Barnaby Thorne's hands had shoved her into the street, she felt her feet under her. This was her place. Not on sufferance. Not until a man with a deed decided otherwise. Hers, that first night she made a bed of empty flour sacks behind the counter, in the deep quiet of the dead store, and she lay looking up at the high dark ceiling and the pale squares of the soaped-over windows, and she let herself feel, for the first time, the full size of what had been done to her and what she had done about it. She had lost her father, her mother, her home, and the store that was her birthright, all inside 2 years, and a whole town had watched the last of it happen and kept its doors shut. By every measure the world used, she had been beaten. And yet here she lay, 19 years old, on the floor of a store that was hers, bought, deeded, paid for with her father's hard day money, in a town that had never wronged her, that did not know her, that she could serve from the beginning with a clean heart. She had not gotten her father's store back. She understood, lying there, that she never would, and that some wrongs simply do not get undone. But she had gotten a counter. And a counter, she knew better than she knew anything, was all a person like her had ever needed to build a whole life on. She slept, and in the morning she rose stiff and cold and clear-eyed, and began. She had $10 gone and almost nothing to stock the shelves with, and so she did the thing her father had taught her, which was that a store is not its goods but its trust, and trust can be extended in both directions. She had a little credit at the freight house on the strength of the deed, and she used it to bring in the plainest necessities: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, thread, kerosene. The small, indispensable things a town cannot make its own 2-day haul for, and she opened the doors of the Roselle Mercantile with a nearly empty store and a full credit book, and she extended to the 100 worn souls of that town the same faith her father had taught her to extend. She let them buy on credit, in a lean season, on nothing but her judgment of their honesty. It was a risk that would have made Emmett Krall laugh. But Clementine knew what the ledger really was, not a list of debts, but a list of who she had chosen to trust. And the town knew it too, knew it the moment she wrote the first name in the book. because being trusted was a thing Roselle had gone 6 years without, and a town that is trusted again begins, almost at once, to become worth trusting. Within a month, the store was the heart of the town again, the stove surrounded of an evening, the counter-busy old Dorcas Webb installed behind the post corner she'd kept alive in her parlor, and 100 people who had been slowly forgetting how to be a town remembering, over sugar and thread and credit, how it was done. She restored the building the way she restored the trade, patiently, from the front counter back. She scrubbed the tall windows until the light came pouring in. She set the leaning shelves plumb and stocked them as fast as the trade would allow. And she came, at last, to the deep back of the store, to the great provision fixtures. Because a store that meant to truly reopen needed its flour bin working, and the huge built-in hopper stood dry and dead and full of the caked, weevil-ruined remains of flour 6 years old. She meant only to empty it and clean it and put it back to use. She had no notion it held anything but ruin. But when she had scooped and swept it empty down to the boards, she found what 6 years of dust and a founder's careful hands had hidden. The back panel of the great flour bin was false. She knew it the way her father had taught her to know a short wait, by a wrongness she felt before she could prove it. The bin was deep, but not as deep inside as its great bulk promised from the front. She rapped the back panel, and where the sides of the bin gave the dull thud of solid plank against the wall behind, the back panel rang slightly hollow. A storekeeper knows her own fixtures the way she knows her own hands, and this fixture had a space behind it that had no honest reason to be there. She found the seam at last, low in the corner where the flour dust had packed hardest, and worked it, and the whole false back of the flour bin swung out on a cleverly hidden pivot, a storekeeper's hiding place, built by a man who understood that the last place a thief looks is the bottom of the flour, and behind it a shallow closet let into the thick back wall of the store. And in it, on a shelf out of reach of the damp, sat a small iron strong-box, a heavy ledger bound in cracked leather, and a folded letter laid on top, the paper gone amber, the hand strong and old-fashioned and kind, to the one who reopens my store. Her hands were steady. A storekeeper's hands are trained to be steady on the scale, but she sat down on an upturned cracker barrel before she read it, because she already understood that this was a thing meant for her, and that she should be sitting. If you have found this, the letter began, then you have emptied the flour bin, and if you have emptied the flour bin, then you mean to sell flour again, and if you mean to sell flour again, then you mean to reopen my store, and that is the only thing I have prayed for since I grew too old and too alone to keep it open myself. So sit down, whoever you are, and let an old storekeeper talk to you the way storekeepers talk. Across the counter, plain and unhurried, for I have been dead a long time, waiting for you to come. And the dead are patient, but they do like company. His name was Josiah Roselle, and he had founded the town and built the Mercantile and kept it for 40 years, and he had a thing to leave and a thing to explain, and he was not sure, he wrote, which mattered more. The explaining went back to the town's whole life. Roselle had come to the high country as a young man when the copper was first struck, and he had built his store, and he had watched the town boom around it, wild and rich and cruel, the way copper towns were. And he had made, over 40 years, a decision that shaped everything. He had run his store as a mercy and not a mine. When the copper company paid its men in scrip good only at the company store, Josiah Roselle took the scrip at the Mercantile at full value, at a loss to himself, so the men would not be robbed. When a season was lean, he carried families on credit he knew he might never collect. When the mine had accidents, and it had many, he was the one who quietly provisioned the widows. He had grown modestly rich in the good years, and had given most of it back to the town across his counter in 10,000 small mercies. And the ledger beneath the flour bin, he wrote, was the record of it, 40 years of credit extended, much of it never repaid, and never meant to be. It is not a list of debts, he wrote, in words that stopped Clementine's breath because they were her father's words exactly. It is a list of the people I chose to trust. I would not collect a penny of it. I leave it only so that whoever comes after will know what this store was, and what it was for. And then the other thing. Because Josiah Roselle had died the way such men do, rich in the town's love and poor in family, with no wife living and no child, and he had faced the question of what becomes of a good store when its keeper dies with no heir. He had seen it before. In other towns, the store sold to some hard man from the county seat, who ran it as a mine after all, who called in the old credit and squeezed the widows and turned the town's heart into a machine for taking. He could not bear it. So he had done the only thing a man with no heir and a great love could do. He had taken his savings, 40 years of a careful, generous man's money, more than the town would ever have guessed he kept, for he lived plain and gave much. And he had sealed it behind the flour bin, and he had written this letter, and he had left it all not to a person, for he had no person, but to a condition, to whoever should some day come and reopen his store. Not buy it to strip it. Reopen it. Light it, stock it, stand behind the counter, and keep it as he had kept it. I do not leave this to make someone rich, he wrote. I leave it to make someone able. Whoever you are, if you have opened this bin, you have already shown me your heart. For no one empties a flour bin to the boards and cleans it for use who does not mean to feed a town. The money is yours, not to keep idle, but to do what I did, to stock the shelves, to carry the lean families, to take the widow's scrip at full value, to be the heart of this hard place. Keep the store, and keep it kind, and the money will have done what my whole life tried to do, and write your own name in the front of that ledger, under mine, for a store is a chain of keepers, and I would be glad past telling to know the chain did not end with me. J. Roselle, at the counter, this quiet autumn, 1878. Clementine Ashford sat on the cracker barrel in the back of the store with the letter in her hands and the late light coming gold through the newly scrubbed windows, and she understood that she had not found a treasure. She had found a torch, handed down a chain of keepers, and she was being asked to carry it. She opened the strongbox. Inside, in canvas sacks gone stiff with age, was Josiah Roselle's 40 years of careful saving, coin, gold, and silver, more money than she had ever seen or imagined, enough to stock the finest mercantile in the territory and carry a town through a dozen lean winters. And she opened the ledger and read a few of the entries in the founder's strong old hand. A widow's flour carried 3 years. A miner's family provisioned through a hurt season, marked paid in full when the man came back to work, though the sum showed he had never paid a cent, and she wept, sitting there. Not for the money, but for the recognition. Because a dead man 40 years her senior had left his life's work to whoever loved a store the way her father had taught her to love one. And out of the whole hard, indifferent world, it was she who had emptied the bin. She thought, sitting on that cracker barrel, in the gold evening light, of the darkened windows of the town that had thrown her out, of all the people who had chosen their own safety over her justice, and she found, to her surprise, that the old wound had gone quiet. Because here was the answer to it, the thing that made the whole cruel arithmetic of that other town beside the point. A man she had never met, who had died before she was born, had reached down 40 years and chosen her, not for her blood, which he did not share, and not for her luck, which she did not have, but for the one thing about her that no stepfather could throw into the street, and no frightened town could shut its door against: her love of the trade. Her understanding that a store was a mercy dressed up as a business. Barnaby Thorne had taken her father's store. But he could never have found what was behind the flour bin, because a man like that would have sold the fixtures for lumber and never once thought to empty a bin and clean it for use. The inheritance had passed him by and come to her across 40 years and 100 miles, precisely because she was the kind of person the world kept throwing out. And that, she understood at last, was not luck at all. It was justice, the slow, patient, roundabout justice of a world in which the people who love the right things are, in the end, the only ones who can find what those things leave behind. She did exactly what he asked, and she did it for the rest of her life. She did not report the strongbox to Emmett Krull or the county because it had not been left to be reported and taxed and made into a thing men talked about. It had been left to reopen a store, and she reopened it, and no one needed to know the how of it but her. She stocked the Roselle Mercantile until it was the finest for 50 miles, not to sell to the rich, for there were no rich in Roselle, but to serve the 100 who had stayed, and then the families who began, slowly, to come back. Because a town with a real store again is a town worth coming back to. She carried the lean families on credit, as Roselle had, as her father had. She took what little scrip and barter the poor could offer at full value. She installed old Dorcas Webb behind a proper post counter and made the store the beating heart of a town that had nearly forgotten how to live. And in the front of Josiah Roselle's great ledger, under his name, in her own fair clear hand, she wrote Clementine Ashford, Keeper, 1891, and she meant to keep it. Roselle did not become a boomtown again. The copper was gone, and stayed gone, and some towns simply do not get to be rich twice. But it lived. A store brought a school, and a school brought families, and families brought a church repainted, and a street reboarded, and a town that had been dying on its feet standing up again. Emmett Krull, who had told her she was buying a headstone, came up the line within 2 years on business and found the dead street he remembered gone to life, the Mercantile bright and busy at the heart of it, and had the grace to stand in the doorway and tell the young keeper that he had never been so glad to be so wrong about a town or a girl. And Barnaby Thorne, the stepfather, the charming widower who had thrown her into the street? The story reached her over the years, the way stories do, carried up the line by teamsters and drummers. Her father's old store down in the low country had not prospered under him. A store is trust, and Barnaby Thorne had none to extend and none to draw on. He had called in the credit and squeezed the town and run the place as the machine for taking that Josiah Roselle had feared, and the town had done to him quietly what towns do. Traded elsewhere, withheld its faith, let his heart store starve on its hard heart. He wrote to Clementine, once when word reached him that his thrown-out stepdaughter had somehow made herself the prosperous keeper of a mercantile up the line, a careful, wheedling letter, family being family, and times being hard, and surely she would not see her own mother's husband want. She read it behind her counter, with Josiah Roselle's ledger at her elbow and her own name written under his. And then she did the only thing that fit. She sent him no money. She sent him a single page, in her fair clear hand, a copy of the first entry from her father's old credit book, the one in her father's writing, from the year she was born, a struggling young family carried through a hard winter marked paid in full. With her father's note beside it, A store is trust. She added one line of her own beneath it. My father knew what a store was for. I am sorry you never learned. She sent nothing else, and Barnaby Thorne did not write again. If you go up into the high country today, to the town of Roselle, and it is still there, small and alive, where its copper camp neighbors are gone entirely to sagebrush, and the county history credits its survival to the reopening of the Mercantile, the store still stands at the center of the street, and it is a store still, kept by the inheritors of the trade Clementine Ashford handed down in her turn. The great flour bin is at the back, and its false panel is left open now behind glass, showing the shallow closet where a founder hid his life savings for whoever would love his store enough to find them. And on the counter, under a pane of glass, they keep two things: a heavy leather ledger, open to a front page, where two names are written, 40 years apart, in two different hands, under the founder's own, for the chain did not end with Clementine either. And every keeper of the Roselle Mercantile since has written their name in that book on their first day, and been told that a store is not a business, but a trust, and that the ledger is not a list of debts, but a list of the people you have chosen to trust. And beside the ledger, in an old amber paper hand, the letter that begins, to the one who reopens my store. There is a kind of inheritance that does not pass through blood, but through trade, through the counters of honest stores and the ledgers of generous keepers, handed down not to the one who will get rich from it, but to the one who will keep the fire under the coffee pot and carry the widow through the winter. It waits in the dark behind the flour. For the one who empties the bin because they mean to feed a town. The world had told Clementine Ashford she was worthless the same way it had told that store it was dead, with a slammed door and a low price and a soaped-over window. It only ever takes one person who knows what a store is truly for to prove the world's cold arithmetic wrong. Clementine Ashford was 19 years old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, her father's hard day money, and she spent it on a boarded-up Mercantile on the dead street of a dying town in the Wyoming Territory. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has a shopkeeper or a stranger behind some counter ever shown you a kindness you never forgot? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.